Walking around the streets of Paris right now or London, you're seeing something that is far more damaging and far more dangerous to your country than anything that Russia could conceivably ever mount. And what am I talking about? Well, you're seeing your country fall into the hands of recent migrants who are unalterably opposed to your way of life, to your culture, to your religion. They, in turn, are attempting to set up some facsimile of the country from which they came, the society from which they emerged. This is immediate and it's dangerous. Now, the elites, and when I mean elites, I'm talking about the people largely with money, with the ability to insulate themselves from what happens inside their societies. We have them, you have them. They're not terribly concerned, and they view or they criticize their own populations for their lack of tolerance. Well, they're not being knifed in broad daylight. They're not being assaulted, brutalized, or raped. They're not dealing with this sort of in-your-face cultural assault that people in Great Britain and France and Germany are seeing every day. So I think the population doesn't have much tolerance left. The other thing is that I have never seen, and perhaps you have, I don't know, but in my times in Europe, I have seen no appetite for a knockdown, drag-out war with anybody, least of all Russia. And if you mention to most of the people I know in Germany or Austria, certainly in Central East Europe, let's all march east and go into Ukraine to save Ukraine from the Russians, they look at you as though you've lost your mind. They're happy to send untold quantities of money and cash and equipment as long as it doesn't hurt them economically, obviously, and that's about to bite very hard right now. They don't care. They're not interested in that at all. So I think what we have to do is something that I think President Putin has done. President Putin has exercised a great deal of patience. He's being very patient, waiting for this tide of change to sweep over Europe. It's coming. And President Trump's message to the Europeans is going to accelerate that process. The real question is how soon do Americans wake up and recognize that Washington has led them down a blind alley? And that's one of the reasons that I did write the article that I did today about this shift in global power and influence and wealth to the East. It's not because I'm celebrating the demise of the West in any way, shape, or form. And the West doesn't necessarily have to go down as a result of this. But what the West has to recognize is that there are multiple powers in the world today. There are other poles of influence and strength and power. Just because China or India or Iran or any number of other countries and Russia are now powerful actors on the world stage doesn't translate into danger for us. And that's been the problem now, I would say, certainly since 1991. People want to interpret in Washington, D.C., the emergence of other power centers as inevitably damaging to the United States. That's not true. War as a means of extending power, of imposing your will, is increasingly, I think, obsolete. It's something that doesn't make sense. And I don't see any evidence that the Chinese or the Russians or the Indians or the Japanese or any number of powers out there are turning to the use of military power to achieve their ends. In fact, I think they're all interested in avoiding it. We are the ones that seem to think that military power is a great tool of statecraft. It's not. You could talk to anybody like Ambassador Freeman, anyone who's been a professional diplomat over the last 30 or 40 years will all say the same thing. In statecraft, in international relations, the military instrument is the least attractive because it's the most difficult to control and it's the last choice. And we've been using it and using it and using it. We look at the desert we've created as a result of the use of our military power. We declare victory and we move on. And the people at home in the United States, they don't sense it because they don't feel the pain. Well, that's beginning to change for reasons of economics, because of the financial system and the dangerous and perilous position we're in. And we're not alone. The Europeans are in a very similar position to us economically and financially. And I think all of this is going to come to a halt. But like everything else, when you say that, people say, well, when is this going to happen? Uh, I can't pinpoint the day and time. I'm not Nostradamus, but I think it's pretty obvious that things are going to come to a screeching halt financially and economically. We can do one of two things. We can jump into a hole and pull the hole down on top of us and hide out and pretend nothing's changed and that we're the greatest. Or we can recognize that the world really has changed. There's a new constellation of powers, and we ought to be part of the new constellation. How do we do that? How do we get into this new constellation of powers? Are we going to sit here in the middle of the Pacific and the Atlantic, thumb our noses at everyone? Or are we going to find a role for ourselves? Instead of looking at the One Belt, One Road program as some sort of fatal danger that has to be combated, insisting that it has purely military utility, which is nonsense, we've got to look at where we fit in. Can we plug into this? Can we offer something? We've got to ask ourselves, what are we going to produce that other people want? What are we going to bring to the table that people respect and are interested in? I think we've got a lot of potential. We seem to have forgotten it. If you go back from the period of world history between 1870 and 1970, everything you enjoy today, from electric lighting to gas heating to automobiles, you name it, all the various vaccinations that do work, these things all have their origins in the United States with brilliant inventions. Well, I think we need to get to work. We need to go to the workbench and start inventing and innovating and get out of this business of trying to figure out how we can bludgeon and bully people to move in whatever direction they want. By the way, there's a great article in the National Interest, and it's by Graham Allison, who makes exactly this point. I think people are figuring this out, but right now, Washington doesn't understand. It's not simply Donald Trump. It's the entire ruling political class. What we have to do is something that happened over time after 1492. The reason I invoked 1492 is a good friend of mine in Croatia was looking at what was going on in Belgrade and other major capitals and looked at the influx of Chinese investment and so forth. And he just offhandedly said to me, we're beginning to see something that is significant. Maybe this is 1492 all over again. And that triggered the article that I wrote, because I think he's got a point. We're seeing new trade routes, new opportunities, and we're recognizing that other states, other economies have comparative advantages. Every nation state, in my judgment, at some point, has to identify its comparative advantage in certain areas. It has to recognize that in other areas, they don't have a comparative advantage. That's all right. You rectify that situation by economic cooperation through trade and commerce. So that's what we have to sit down and think about. One of the things I also mentioned in that article that we've ignored for a very long time, if you go back 100 years ago, we had probably the world's largest merchant marine fleet. One of the reasons we were able to so rapidly resupply the British overseas, both in World War I and then in World War II, was that we had this enormous merchant fleet. What happened to it? We essentially opted out. Somebody decided that they could make more money by selling it off than they could by maintaining it and exploiting it. Same thing is true with rail. The United States had probably the greatest railroad system in the world. This is especially true after 1870. Once we have the Civil War behind us, what have we done with it? Perhaps we're all waiting for the aliens to land and to provide us with some new technologies that makes everything we own obsolete. Maybe that'll happen at some point, but right now we're still dealing with the laws of physics. There is a good rationale for the United States that sits in the middle of the world to invest very heavily in fast sea lift and fast high-speed rail. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at Rome and the Roman Empire, the big advantage the Romans had was they sat in the middle of the Mediterranean. And with their legions and fleets and roads and bridges, they could create networks of trade that made Rome wealthy and powerful. Now, nothing ever lasts forever, But my point is we need to look at that example and begin to see ourselves a little differently. Instead of looking at the One Belt, One Road as a danger, can we build a fast sea lift that can move goods, say, from Rochefort in France to the east coast of the United States, put them on high-speed rail, and move from there to Los Angeles or San Francisco or Puget Sound and Seattle, Washington, and then from there rapidly to Europe on fast sea lift? Now, I'm saying Europe, Japan and Northeast Asia and China. We also have this Arctic passage that's opened up. There are a lot of reasons for us to look into this. Why? Because we have had historically a tremendous advantage. The advantage is that from Atlantic to Pacific, from Pacific to Atlantic, we speak one language. We have one law. When you move goods from Shanghai all the way up through Central Asia and then down into the Middle East or west towards Europe, how many countries and nation states do you pass through? How expensive is it to move those things? Every one you encounter, and I've got friends that are in China tell me this all the time, as soon as you show up and you're Chinese, say, we want to build a terminal here, we want to put this here, everyone stands there and says, here's my hand, fill it with cash, please. Well, there's no requirement for that. We can move everything from coast to coast without going through multiple countries. We need to think about this. We have refused to think about it. We have refused to invest in it. Instead, where have we spent trillions of dollars? Trillions of dollars intervening in countries and societies that are radically different from ours, in many cases killing hundreds of thousands, displacing millions, destroying economies, distorting regional dynamics, distorting power arrangements in favor of what we think is to our advantage. Well, I've been looking over the last 30 plus years of interventions. I can't find any advantage. I don't see how we strategically have profited dramatically from any of these interventions. Yet that's the underlying assumption in Washington. You intervene in Libya, and what do you get for your trouble? You get chaos. You destroyed the dynamics in the region. Everyone in North Africa is afraid of you. No one really trusts you. We've ignored that. Now, the Middle East is a unique set of circumstances. Every place you go is different. We have to understand that. We've never bothered to look at it from that vantage point. And we have to get out of this business of, once again, seeing military power as the solution that will make us happy, make us rich, make us powerful. It isn't working. It hasn't worked. It's a dead end.